Hi, and welcome to Unit 2, Day 3 of our Intro to Argumentation unit. Today we're going to continue to examine the complexities of argumentation. You will notice that in today's lesson our agenda is pretty sparse, and that is because we are really focusing on taking good notes today. So please make sure that you pause the video as you need, that if questions arise, you either get those in your note catcher so you can ask the teacher later, or that you actually ask those questions live in class through the chat function or by unmuting yourself. We are going to be using the notes that you take today throughout the entire rest of the unit, so it's super important that you do take time to really understand argumentation. At the end of today's lesson, you're going to complete a mastery check. It aligns with our objective, which is focusing on complexities of argumentation, but it is a multiple choice, so it will be an Edulastic. As I mentioned earlier, our objective is to continue examining the complexities of argumentation, and that means that we need to cover these two AP English skills. The first one is understanding that when we are entering into an ongoing conversation, it means that we are engaging with positions that have already been considered and argued about. So we're not just going in and saying, this is what I believe, and ignoring everything else. We're still pulling in like context of like what other people have argued in the past, the pros, the cons, the different perspectives, and so keeping that in mind as we craft our argument. We also need to understand this idea of concession. So when a writer concedes, they either accept all or portion of a competing position. So an opposing argument, I might say, yeah, you are right when you think this. Or I might accept a part of that opposing argument. So like, yes, I agree that this is blah, 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 but we've missed the major point, which is this. And so again, we need to understand that argumentation is not just this or that. It is more complex and nuanced. So we want to avoid this or that argumentation, like it's either this or it's that, because that falls into a dangerous single perspective. And as you remember from yesterday, we listened to Chimamanda Adichie's TED Talk on the danger of a single story. And one of the quotes that really resonated with me throughout that TED Talk is projected. And she said, the single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And so as we start to think about argumentation, we don't want to just simplify something to a single non-open-minded perspective or single story. We want to acknowledge multiple perspectives while still maintaining a stance that we are hoping to defend. So in order to do that, in order to prevent from oversimplifying our argument or preventing a biased one-sided view, we really need to consider some of the lenses or some of the stakeholders involved with the issue. So I like to refer to these as lenses, like a political lens, an economic lens, a social, cultural lens, a historical lens. And so what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be taking a look at a specific argument prompt and taking a look at that prompt through different lenses to see the different perspectives that stakeholders in this group might have. Ultimately, we want to observe issues in a more complex way. So let's take a look at just a simple prompt. Here's the prompt: colonizing Mars. Should we or shouldn't we? Step one, when we look at this prompt, and this is in your note catcher, so please make sure you're getting this down, is to determine a preliminary opinion on the prompt. So immediately, what is your reaction to this? Should we actually go and colonize Mars or should we not? And you should have some reasoning for that. You shouldn't just be like, yes, because I said so. You should have some like reasoning there. Step two is to review the list of different lenses or fields, and which of these lenses is important to consider when answering the prompt. So as I'm taking a look at this, immediately the scientific lens kind of applies here. I'm like, is that even feasible, scientifically feasible? And so that is something that I need to consider when I'm answering this prompt. But after taking a bit more time, which you should walk through each of these, like, okay, if it is scientifically feasible, what other lenses might I apply to think about the different perspectives on this issue? Maybe it's a political lens, like, and I'll show you some examples in just a second. Maybe it's an economic lens, like, do we have the money to actually do this? Does the U.S. have the capacity to actually do this right now? Scientific, we talked about. Historical, like, has anything like this been done in the past? And if so, were there different pros or cons from that specific colonization? Environmental lens, an ethical lens. So is this ethically, morally right to go and colonize Mars? What ethical issues might arise from doing that? And so here are some of the perspectives within the lenses. And so you're going to want to make sure that you kind of get some of these down as examples for your own exploration of an argument prompt later. So when we think of science and we think of like colonizing Mars, here are some perspectives that we might want to include. We do have the technological capabilities to create an atmosphere and to get colonists there and to sustain life. We can't get colonists home from Mars, though. And then the lifespan of colonists will not be as long as on Earth. And so these are just some of the perspectives to have within that scientific lens or scientific field when we're thinking about this prompt. For history, we might want to consider the space race, which inspired Americans in STEM learning. And so if we have that historical context, we might want to think about that as we're developing our argument. So like, is that a positive? Was the space race a really positive thing for Americans? For our economic lens, the technology to build an atmosphere and sustain life will be very expensive, and that's something to consider. Do we have the funding right now to actually send Americans to Mars to live there? And then we also need to consider, once there, what will be the economic system on Mars? Is it going to be the same thing as what's in the United States? For environmental, we need to colonize Mars in case Earth can no longer sustain life. So as we know, with global warming, that the Earth is heating up, our population continues to expand. And so this could be a stance or perspective to have in colonizing Mars, like we should, because there's no telling how long we can sustain life on Earth. Environmental, we should invest in resources to save Earth instead of colonizing Mars. Maybe someone's like, that's so much money. Why don't we just invest in like stronger regulations of pollution and stronger regulations of corporations? A few more are the political lens and the ethical lens. So thinking politics, there might be differing political affiliation, like stances on colonizing. So like, is this like going to be a divide between Republican and Democrat, etc.? Two, what is the government, or what the government would be and who would run it? So we need to consider like, what is the actual government structure on Mars? Three, is it really worth the expense? Or will politicians just kind of use this solely for the historical recognition? So is this just like something that politicians might jump on board with so that they get their name in the history books? And then not worth the expense because it will upset voters who prefer the money to go to debt relief, healthcare, education. As we know, we're in a pandemic, we're in an economic crisis. And so we could make an argument that like trying to fund this colonization of Mars is not worth our time right now, and that the money could be spent better elsewhere. Ethics, we've already talked about some of these. You'll notice that they overlap, but it could save human life if something happens to Earth, which we mentioned. Or it's also like, are we jeopardizing human life? Because colonists will not be able to return. So what if someone gets sick and they don't have the resources on Mars to get the proper cancer treatment that they need, etc.? The lifespan of colonists will not be as long. So those that are sent will have to know that they potentially will die sooner than they would on Earth. And then colonizing Mars could cause tension and competition between other nations. If the United States is the one doing it, what right does the United States have to colonize Mars over another nation? So these are just ethical questions and perspectives to have as we enter into what is our actual stance. So by examining these different fields or lenses on this topic, we begin to realize that this issue isn't just black or white. There are multiple perspectives within each of these lenses. So by exploring the various perspectives within the fields or lenses, we begin to see this isn't a simple pro-con or black and white issue. Instead, we see that there are many complexities or shades of gray. There are the political, the environmental, the economic implications that make it reasonable to take either stance. So you probably noticed that underneath each lens or field, we had both like people who were pro or perspectives that were pro colonizing Mars and reasoning, perspectives that were against it, and perspectives that like saw the limitations of what could be done. So by acknowledging these different perspectives in our argument, we are demonstrating that we understand the complexities. We are also showing sophistication of thought and that we have spent time delving deep into the topic. So by taking this time to like deconstruct a prompt and really consider the different perspectives, we're avoiding the danger of a single perspective. We're avoiding the danger of a biased perspective. We're actually considering all elements before we start our writing process. All right, so after taking time to kind of take down those notes and explore the different perspectives, what's your decision? Are we colonizing Mars? You may want to pause the video and just practice writing down your position on whether or not to colonize Mars. And you can use some of those perspectives that we saw earlier. You will want to write down at least 3 reasons why you made the decision you made, because remember, these prompts are leading us toward a full essay, and so we would want to have consistent and really specific examples to back up our argument. So it's probably pretty likely that some of the reasons that you listed had opposition, like you have an opposing side to that. So next to your reasons, you would want to write where there are opposing viewpoints. Sometimes the opposition will be from the same lens, but sometimes it will come from a different lens. So for example, maybe your reason was, yes, we should create an atmosphere on Mars to sustain Earth. Earth is not going to last with how overpopulated and polluted it has become. But the opposition there is like, okay, well, if we're just going to send people to Mars, the lifespan of colonists will be shorter. So what you need to consider is like, okay, so how are you going to counter argue, or are you going to concede that that is true and yet the benefits outweigh the cost of going to Mars? So when we're thinking of our reasoning, this time that we took to explore the different perspectives and lenses will help us think through how do we counter argue opposing arguments, or how do we acknowledge and concede that some opposing arguments are right, and yet we still see a benefit to our stance. So as a takeaway from this video, you might be thinking, okay, so I understand that I need to think more complex or think more broadly about the different perspectives before I just form an argument. That is true. The arguments that we want to avoid, and this should say not just argument, but oversimplify that you can, or take notes on that. We should colonize Mars. We should not colonize Mars. These arguments do not explore multiple perspectives. They are not nuanced. They are not complex. They are oversimplified. And that's the danger of the single story that we've talked about. Instead, we want a more complex argument where we have explored all perspectives and shades of gray. And so you'll notice in this argument, although we have the technology to colonize Mars, so it is acknowledging that yes, we have this capability, the money would be better spent investing on improving environmental issues on Earth. This stance clearly addresses the opposing side, and yet it tells us what we should be doing with the money and technology that we already have. And so notice the difference between the oversimplified argument and the more complex argument. All right, so that wraps up our notes for today. Your mastery check is an AP exam practice today, and that is multiple choice. Even though it is multiple choice, it still includes that complexity of argumentation that we've been talking about. You will just need to read a piece and kind of examine the complexities of argumentation within that reading and answer some multiple choice questions in Edulastic. As always, if you have questions, please reach out to your teacher, and stay tuned for next lesson.